So what can you learn from Jon Rahm's golf swing? This swing wins tournaments. This player is world class. We're going to take a look at his stance. We're going to take a look at the way he moves in relationship to that stance. We're going to look at where he gets his power from. And at the same time, I'm going to try and relate this to normal everyday golfers as well, so you can see what you can take from this world class action, while at the same time ignoring some of the other bits that we just simply might not ever be able to do. So let's take a look at his stance, how he sets up to the ball. Jon has a very, what I would call kind of triangular shaped setup, very strong, very, very powerful. Obviously, he's a super strong human being. The size of him, the thickness of him, is something that we'll see reflected in his swing as well as his setup. But when we compare his setup to your everyday amateurs, and I've got a few here, what you notice, and this is quite common with more tour players than you realise, is how wide they stand. He's setting up in a way that is built for power and energy. It's built for stretch. It's built for extreme movements. Where often you, the average golfer, the everyday golfer down that lens, is setting up more for comfort, for a nice movement. But to be world class like he is being, and to be strong like he is, his setup needs to accompany those ideas. And we see that. I'm guesstimating here, but I reckon his width of stance in his driver is around 20 to 23 inches on my plate. Where we do tend to see from everyday amateurs a much more conservative stance because of the conservative move. So they're getting more around 19 inches, 20 inches kind of is a lot for an amateur in their minds. But starting with that wider base, if you want to start stretching and giving it a wallop, certainly with the driver, I think is a great place to begin. Look at me playing on the plate here. What you'll see, I mean, I struggle to do this as well. If I get to say around 23 inches, I think that looks quite Rahm-esque. It looks like what we see from Jon, where my natural stance is much more near 21. I have to force it out to that wide, and then in turn to force my stretch. So yes, changing your stance feels weird, but with Jon, we definitely see what I would call a very power-built stance. Then when we move into the backswing, we see this really common characteristic with better players, which everyday golfers don't do. And this is this early shift into the trail foot with their pressure. You can see it here with the tree on Jon's lead hip. He moves away from that tree almost instantly, and then starts to kind of recenter as the club goes up over his head. And this is something that lots of you watching this video simply just don't do. What you do is you spend a lot of time moving over onto your trail foot. So the start of your downswing, you often have a lot of pressure on your trail foot. At the start of Jon's downswing, he is already starting to go target bound. As you can see as the club is still going back, his hips are actually already starting to shove down and forwards as he's starting to load as early as possible to make sure he gets the energies out early. Now this is something that everyday golfers can absolutely change. So these pressure shift ideas are something you can practice. To be fair, often it's off ball with a little bit of ball in between. So let's say you practice once a week, you could be doing 5 minutes of this every day to then go and try and take it to the range. Just taking it to the range is hard because it's a little bit like doing this for lots of golfers because they don't even know where they're shifting pressure. So we see the trend with amateurs of them moving generally onto their trail side and just keep going onto their trail side, then starting their downswing going back this way, where we see a big trend with better players where they shift their pressures onto this foot early, and then from here upwards they start actually recentering their pressures and their hip because they're starting to go this way as they complete their backswing. So it's a completely different use. They're starting their downswings from a different place with where they're pushing in the ground, which then in turn moves their body in a different way. So what I would like to see more golfers try, and it's tough, but give it a practice, is as you take the club back for the first foot and your hand tends to move, say, from lead leg over trail leg as you look from this angle, I want to move my pressures with it, so I'm going to go with it. So a little bump off the ball, so I feel like my pressures now with the club are all over this trail foot. So I get up to 80-90% onto this foot at this point, and then from here, as the club starts going up and around me, I push the club in my mind out this way, but my body starts going back towards the target to get nowhere near as much as Rahm, but the ideas of my body stretching. What we're seeing amateurs doing is everything going this way, which is why we see less stretch. So it's a really simple way of doing it. Get a club in your house, just feel like you move your pressures onto this foot as you start with your hands getting over this foot. And then from there, Try and recenter. Feel like your pressures rotate, turn back into both feet. It will get you in such a better position to start your downswing. This is a characteristic we see not just with Jon Rahm, but with lots of world-class players. And we tend to not see it very often in handicap golfers. Then we see the trademark Rahm move, which is the short arm swing, or what looks like a short arm swing in relationship to where his body is. Jon Rahm's top of his backswing, just to me, shouts stretch. Like crazy amounts of separation between where he puts his hands to where he's rotated his body. He is like full stretch there. So where we will say it's short in the realms of if it's gone past a parallel, in the realms of how much he's stretching himself out, I say he's not short at all. Now, another thing that's quite interesting with Jon's swing is his wrist angles, which we're going to come on to because I think they apply to so many of you. But we definitely see in amateur game a complete lack of stretch, where with Jon we see the complete opposite, and it's super impressive. What we see Rahm do with his wrists is phenomenal. So he puts a lot of bow in there, and we see this kind of short laid off action, which would be known as a fault for lots of golfers. His gloved hand, his lead hand, it's doing this a lot. If you imagine we start with it what we call extended, so if this is flat, it's extended, he makes a backswing where he puts it into flexion, which is not that common. Obviously, DJ's the other one who we know who does that a lot, along with a few others. Amateurs, as a general rule, seem to struggle much more with adding loads more extension, which then controls the club face in a weaker way, more loft, more open to a path, which is why we see those weaker shots as well. Now, think about this, and you can do this at home. Just watching this video, put your arm out in front of you, lead arm, so for me left, and just wrist alone, so keeping your lead arm and hand all in line. Just look at the range of movement you've got down to up. Loads more down than you do hinging it up. Hardly any up. Yet we do tend to see amateurs get into these quite kind of what we would call hinged positions. It's not hinged because if you just seen your range of movement this way is really limited. Now what happens if I make a backswing with a bowed wrist, and this is common for amateurs and pros alike, I mean, I can't get much. So if I keep this all stretched away like we see Rahm doing, I'm here, I'm stuck in Rahm position, and my trail hand is coming off the club because to get where he gets is remarkable stretch with a bowed wrist. Now, if I extend my lead wrist, I can get where he gets easily, and look what happens to the club. It can start going way further back. And then if I break this down like lots of amateurs do, we start seeing these positions. And it's not that I'm hinging my wrist more. What happens is if I extend my wrists, so we're going to put it this way, extended, and then start to hinge up, the two bones in my arm start to flip over, allowing me to actually get loads more what appears to be hinge. It's not. It's that my arm is rotating as well, giving me these kind of long, loose swings that we see compared to the opposite. And Jon Rahm's an extreme, where he's bowing that wrist with stretch, which is why we see it as short. Again, I don't see it as short. I understand it's short in relationship to parallel because it's up here. You try and get in Jon Rahm's position now, with a club or without. Bow your wrist, stretch your arm out, and then try and put your other hand on where it would be on the club. Like, it's mental. It's so athletic. When you want to learn from Jon, he's taking it to extremes, and we're going to see his extreme wrist, what it does to the face, and in turn what it does to his impact as we play through to his impact, because it's fantastic to see. But what you could take from Jon's ideas is the more you work the wrist into a flatter or even bow position, subject to where you start, all you're going to see is shots that have a tendency to go pretty straight to even curve to the left, and they tend to not go too high, because by using your wrist more in a flatter fashion, to him going beyond flat, he is taking loft off that club, and he is getting it set in a way that could be very easily closed to a par for lots of normal everyday golfers. Now with that powerful backswing loaded up and the downswing, if you think about it, already starting as he's finishing off loading up that backswing, which is key to all these first movements we've talked about, we see a classic impact position of someone who's twisting the face the way he's twisting it. We're going to see what I would call more of an under follow through and impact, where we're going to see trail shoulder going super low compared to many amateurs, which again encourages fantastic handle to face deliveries to make sure he's delivering the right loft. and the right club path to make sure all these movements balance. So again, if you don't do these wrist angles, which most people don't, even though maybe you should reflect them a little bit more, he's obviously the extreme end, then you wouldn't be seeing these impact positions in your action. And you shouldn't, because again, it's the matchup. So if you wanted to move to these kind of impact positions that you see from world-class players, which often is the case, people go to the range and say, I want to get into that position I see my favourite players get into, or my impact looks different compared to what I see, from better players. Well, that's because your impact has to match up all these other bits that have gone before, which is why it's so important that you don't just try and isolate one position. They've all got to work together. And that's what we see continuously from world-class players. And we absolutely see it in Jon Rahm's swing. It's a classic example of how there is no classic swing. There are only functional ones. And this one is super functional. Then the other thing we see with impact is the fantastic use of the ground, how his lead foot almost kicks out and kicks back. He is pushing so hard in that ground, it pushes back, and it's moving him out of that impact position, allowing him to really post up on that lead leg, allowing him to really stall certain parts of his body to make sure his energies are being thrown out to the ball. And that is always something that amateurs really, really struggle with. They're generally just everything's still moving as they hit the ball, meaning they can't really kind of get that energy flinging out to the end, the head. So they're losing so much, where he's the opposite. He's maximizing everything he's putting in. With the shape of him, we're going to get a long hitter, which we see. Another real little intricate part of Jon Rahm's swing that's so interesting, which amateurs tend to not do, is look how tappy he is and active with his feet through the swing at the beginning. He's tapping them, he's feeling the ground because he's getting ready to move and be dynamic. So many amateurs hit their shots and just basically sink into the ground and kind of sway across it. Getting those dynamic feet movements, lightening up your feet, feeling them tapping, feeling the ground, left, right, forward, back, is great for dynamic movement. The similar kind of jumping around a goalkeeper will do before the penalty is going to be taken. They're not just going to sink and stay. They're going to be tapping, moving around, a little bit of set, then go. And then moving through to a really nice looking normal follow through position, where I think if we just held these images, we wouldn't have been able to see what had gone much before. It just ends up in a classic looking position. The standout features for me that you can learn from is the impact positions are a reflection of everything else that's gone before. And if you want to start improving your impact position more like a pro, this video here has got my best drill for absolutely transforming golfers' impact positions.